The largest church in Christendom falls silent. It is Christmas Day, year 800, inside St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Charles, King of the Franks, kneels before the altar in prayer. He is a towering figure, nearly 6 feet tall, in an age when the average man stands only 5 feet 6 inches. His fair hair and laughing face are well known throughout Europe, but today his expression is solemn. Behind him stands Pope Leo III, the very man Charles saved from assassination just 2 years earlier. The Pope raises a golden crown high above the kneeling king. In one swift gesture, Leo places it upon Charles's head. Then, in a stunning reversal of protocol, the Pope himself prostrates before the newly crowned emperor. The assembled crowd erupts in ancient Roman acclamation. To Charles Augustus, crowned by God great and peace-giving emperor of the Romans, life and victory. The words echo through the basilica 3 times. According to Einhard, Charles's biographer and close companion, the king later claimed he would not have entered the church that day had he known the Pope's intention. Whether this was genuine surprise or diplomatic maneuvering remains debated. What is certain is this. For the first time in more than 300 years, the Western Roman Empire had an emperor, and he was not Roman but Frankish, a Germanic warrior from the forests north of the Alps. How did a Frankish warlord become Roman emperor? The answer lies in an extraordinary synthesis, one that fused Roman administrative genius with Christian religious authority and Germanic warrior culture. Charles created a distinctly European identity that would outlast his empire by centuries. Yet this synthesis contained a fatal flaw. It depended almost entirely on Charles's personal charisma, military prowess, and diplomatic skill. Within 30 years of his death, the unified Carolingian Empire would shatter into 3 separate kingdoms. But here is the paradox that defines Charles's legacy. While his empire fragmented, his cultural achievements endured. 90% of classical Latin texts that survive today exist because Carolingian scribes copied them in the scriptoria Charles established. The Caroline minuscule script developed in his palace schools became the foundation for the lowercase letters we read today. The educational reforms he mandated shaped European learning for 1,000 years. The question is not whether Charles built an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Danube, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. The question is why the political empire collapsed while the cultural legacy endured. To understand this paradox, we must follow Charles from his contested birth in the mid-8th century through 32 years of warfare to that fateful Christmas Day in Rome, and finally to his death in Aachen in January 814.
This is the story of a man called Pater Europae, father of Europe in his own lifetime. It is a story of brutal conquest and cultural flowering, of forced conversions, an educational renaissance, of political fragmentation and institutional endurance. The exact year of Charles's birth remains uncertain. Contemporary sources disagree. Some say 742, others 747 or 748. What is certain is that he was born into the Carolingian dynasty, named for his grandfather, Charles Martel, who had stopped the Muslim advance at Tours in 732. Charles's father was Pippin the Short, who achieved what no Frankish noble had dared for centuries. In 751, with papal approval, Pippin deposed the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, and seized the throne for himself. The move was revolutionary. The Merovingian dynasty, which had ruled the Franks since the 5th century, traced its lineage to legendary kings. Their claim to power rested on blood and ancient right. But the Merovingians had become mere figureheads, ceremonial rulers with no real authority. The true power had long rested with the mayors of the palace, chief officials who governed in the king's names. Pippin was one such mayor's son of Charles Martel, the hero who had stopped the Muslim advance at Tours. Pippin understood that effective power without legitimate title was unstable. So he did something unprecedented. He asked the Pope for permission to make himself king. Pope Zachary agreed, establishing a crucial precedent. The Pope could legitimize rulers, the Church could sanction revolutionary changes in political authority. This fusion of Germanic military power with papal religious authority would become the foundation of the Carolingian system. Pippin had married Bertrada of Laon in 744, though the union was not canonically sanctioned until 749 because the couple was too closely related. Their son Charles received practical training for leadership at his father's court, participating in military campaigns and learning the arts of diplomacy and warfare. The Carolingian age had begun. Einhard, who knew Charles, personally described him as large and strong with lofty stature, though not disproportionately tall. His eyes were very large and animated, his nose a little long, his hair fair, and his face laughing and merry. Skeletal analysis conducted in 2010 confirms that Charles stood between 5 feet 10 inches and 6 feet 4 inches tall, towering over his contemporaries. Einhard also noted Charles's self-discipline. He was temperate in eating and particularly so in drinking, for he abominated drunkenness. He was such an adept swimmer that none could surpass him. He would later build his palace at Aachen specifically to enjoy its warm springs, where he sometimes bathed with 100 or more persons, including his sons, nobles, and bodyguards. When Pippin died in 768, the Frankish realm was divided between Charles and his younger brother Charlemagne. The two brothers disliked each other intensely. The kingdom stood on the brink of civil war. Then, on December 4th, 771, Charlemagne died suddenly. He was not yet 21. No evidence of foul play has ever been found, though the convenience of the death for Charles cannot be ignored. In a stunning betrayal, Charlemagne's own supporters turned against his widow and invited Charles to annex the territory. Charles disregarded the rights of Charlemagne's heirs entirely and took control of the entire Frankish realm. Charlemagne's widow, Gerberga, was forced to flee with her children to Lombardy, where she would plot her revenge. By the end of 771, Charles ruled alone. The stage was set for 3 decades of conquest that would transform Europe. In 772, Charles launched the campaign that would define his reign: the conquest of Saxony. The Saxons were a pagan Germanic people occupying the lands between the Rhine and Elbe rivers. Charles's first strike was devastating. He destroyed Irminsul, the sacred wooden pillar the Saxons called the pillar that holds up the universe. By toppling their most sacred shrine, Charles declared total war, not just on Saxon political independence, but on their very religion and culture. The Saxon response was fierce. Led by a charismatic noble named Widukind, they waged guerrilla warfare against Frankish occupation. Widukind proved a master of hit-and-run tactics, striking settlements, and then melting back into the forests. Charles's response grew increasingly brutal. He issued a draconian law code that imposed the death penalty for practicing pagan rites, refusing baptism, cremating the dead, or even eating meat during Lent. The message was clear: convert to Christianity or die. The turning point came in 782. Charles had left Saxony to campaign against the Slavic Sorbs. In his absence, the Saxons launched a massive uprising, massacring a Frankish army and killing many of Charles's most important nobles. Charles's retaliation was horrifying. At Verden on the Aller River, he demanded that the Saxons surrender those responsible. According to the Royal Frankish Annals, 4,500 Saxon men were handed over. In a single day, all 4,500 were beheaded. The Verden massacre shocked even contemporary observers. The sheer scale required extraordinary logistical organization. It was not battle frenzy, but a deliberate, methodical act of terror. Charles intended to break Saxon resistance once and for all through overwhelming violence. But terror alone could not achieve lasting peace. Widukind remained free, and the Saxons continued to resist. The war that Charles had hoped to finish in a single season would drag on for 32 years longer than the American Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and both world wars combined. While the Saxon Wars consumed Charles's attention, in the north events in Italy created a second front. King Desiderius of Lombardy, the same man sheltering Carloman's widow, seized papal territories and threatened Rome. Pope Adrian I appealed to Charles for military intervention. In 773, Charles crossed the Alps and laid siege to Pavia, the Lombard capital. The siege lasted 9 months through the Italian winter, a testament to Charles's logistical capabilities. During the siege, Charles made a remarkable journey to Rome for Easter 774. He confirmed his father's grants to the papacy and received the title of patrician from the Pope. In early summer 774, Pavia surrendered. Charles became king of the Lombards in addition to king of the Franks. The negotiated surrender contrasts sharply with his brutal treatment of the Saxons, suggesting that Charles calibrated his violence based on strategic calculation rather than bloodlust. Legend claims Charles was crowned with the Iron Crown of Lombardy, a sacred relic supposedly containing a nail from Christ's crucifixion. However, scientific testing in 1993 revealed that the crown's interior band is 99% silver, not iron. The tradition dates only to 1585, nearly 800 years after Charles's era. Whether or not Charles wore the crown, his conquest of Lombardy was real and consequential. In 778, Charles turned his attention to the Iberian Peninsula. He crossed the Pyrenees into Muslim Spain with limited success. More memorable was the disaster on the return journey at Roncevaux Pass Basque. Tribesmen ambushed the Frankish rear guard. Among the dead was Roland, whose death would be immortalized 3 centuries later in the Song of Roland. By 780, Charles had dramatically expanded his realm. He controlled virtually all of Christian Western Europe except the British Isles, southern Italy, and the Iberian Peninsula. But conquest raised a new challenge. How to govern this vast Forkshire, Dexter, diverse empire. With the Lombard kingdom secured, Charles turned his attention to Bavaria and the Avar Khaganate. Tassilo III had ruled Bavaria for nearly 4 decades, maintaining semi-independence. In June 788, Charles convened an assembly at Ingelheim. Tassilo was tried for high treason on charges including desertion from a campaign 25 years earlier. The 25-year gap between alleged offense and prosecution reveals strategic timing rather than justice. Modern scholars characterize the trial as predetermined in outcome using legal forms to legitimize political objectives. Tassilo was sentenced to death, but Charles immediately commuted it to monastic imprisonment. This clemency demonstrated mercy avoided creating a martyr and permanently barred Tassilo from secular rulership. 6 years later, Tassilo was compelled to renounce all rights in Bavaria. Charles had built a web of relationships that made resistance futile. With Bavaria annexed, Charles confronted the Avars who had dominated the Danube basin for 2 centuries. Their wealth was legendary, accumulated through decades of extracting tribute from Byzantium. In 791, Charles launched the first Avar campaign. The decisive breakthrough came in 795 when Eric of Friuli captured the Avar treasure. 15 wagons, each pulled by 4 oxen, were required to transport the loot to Aachen. This windfall financed Charles's cultural programs in the following years. By 803, the Avars had submitted completely. Meanwhile, the Saxon Wars continued. In 785, Widukind finally surrendered and accepted baptism. Charles himself stood as Widukind's godfather, symbolically making the former enemy a spiritual son. But Saxon rebellions continued sporadically. In 797, Charles issued a new law code that reduced the severity of death penalties. This softening suggests Charles was learning that violence could break resistance, but only governance and cultural integration could create stable rule. In 843 years after the destruction of Irminsul, the Saxon Wars officially ended. Charles had fought 18 campaigns over more than 3 decades. Saxony was finally incorporated into the Frankish Empire and would remain Christian. The forced conversion had succeeded, but at tremendous cost in blood and suffering. The Saxon Wars taught Charles a hard lesson. Conquest was easier than consolidation. The sword alone could not create lasting unity. He would need something more, a cultural and institutional framework that could outlast any single military campaign. That framework would emerge in what history calls the Carolingian Renaissance. While Charles's armies conquered territory, a quieter revolution unfolded at his court. In 781, Charles met Alcuin of York, a renowned scholar from Northumbria. Charles invited Alcuin to join his court. And in 782, Alcuin arrived at Aachen to lead the palace school. Alcuin brought the educational system that had flourished in Anglo-Saxon England, the 7 liberal arts consisting of the trivium grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. This curriculum became the foundation for medieval European education and would structure Western learning for 1,000 years. The palace school at Aachen educated Charles's children and the sons of noble families from across the empire. But more importantly, it trained the next generation of administrators, bishops, and abbots who would spread Carolingian culture throughout Europe. These men carried with them not just knowledge, but a standardized approach to education, a common liturgy, and a shared cultural identity. In 789, Charles issued the Admonitio Generalis, the General Admonition Comprehensive Legislation covering educational and ecclesiastical reform. Chapter 72 mandated that every monastery and bishop's residence establish schools to teach psalms, music, singing, and grammar. This governmental mandate provided the impetus for the spread of literacy and learning across the empire. Around 794, Charles sent a letter to Abbot Baugulf of Fulda, known as De Literis Colendis, on the cultivation of letters. The letter emphasized the importance of education. We exhort you not only not to neglect the study of letters, but to apply yourselves thereto with most persevering diligence, so that you may be able to penetrate with greater ease and certainty the mysteries of the Holy Scriptures. Charles understood that an educated clergy was essential for both religious orthodoxy and effective imperial administration. The results were dramatic. Approximately 7,000 Carolingian manuscripts survive compared to only 500 Merovingian manuscripts, a 14-fold increase. This explosion of manuscript production preserved 90% of surviving classical Latin texts. Virtually every Roman author we can read today, Virgil, Cicero, Ovid, Seneca, Tacitus, survives because Carolingian scribes copied their works. The Scriptoria developed Caroline Minuscule, a clear, legible, standardized script that became dominant throughout the Middle Ages. When Renaissance humanists discovered Carolingian manuscripts, they mistook the script for authentic ancient Roman writing and modeled their printing types on it. Thus, the lowercase letters we read today descend directly from the Caroline Minuscule developed in Charles's Scriptoria. The Carolingian Renaissance also produced magnificent illuminated manuscripts. The Godescalc Evangelistary, created between 781 and 783 to commemorate Charles's visit to Pope Hadrian I, showcases the brilliant colors and intricate decorations that characterize Carolingian manuscript illumination. These books were not merely functional texts, but works of art combining beautiful calligraphy with elaborate illustrations that brought biblical stories to life. Charles also undertook ambitious architectural projects. From 792 to 805, he constructed the Palatine Chapel at Aachen, an octagonal structure with Byzantine-inspired architecture that still stands today. The chapel symbolized Charles's ambition to rival Constantinople as a center of Christian civilization. Its design deliberately echoed the great churches of the Eastern Roman Empire, asserting that Aachen could be a new Rome, a new center of Christendom in the West. The Carolingian Renaissance represents a remarkable achievement, a Germanic warrior king deliberately fostering classical learning and Christian scholarship. This was not typical behavior for 8th century rulers who more commonly focused exclusively on warfare and plunder. Charles understood that military power alone was insufficient. He needed an educated clergy to administer his empire, a standardized liturgy to unify his subjects, and a shared cultural identity to outlast his personal authority. The parallels to 20th century American policy are striking. After World War II, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, which combined military security with massive economic and cultural investment in rebuilding Europe. The strategy recognized that lasting peace required more than military victory. It required economic prosperity, political stability, and cultural exchange. Charles, more than 1,000 years earlier, understood the same principle. The sword could win territory, but only culture could create lasting unity. The Carolingian Renaissance was deeply intertwined with religious reform and the fusion of church and state authority. Charles convened 23 synods during his reign, giving him control over episcopal appointments and ecclesiastical policy. Royal and ecclesiastical authority merged in the capitulary system where secular and religious legislation was combined and distributed empire-wide. Parallel to Charles's centralized reforms, a grassroots movement for monastic standardization was underway. Benedict of Aniane founded the monastery of Aniane in 779 as a model of strict Benedictine observance. When Louis the Pious became emperor in 814, he brought Benedict to Aachen. The Aachen councils of 816 and 817 made Benedict's rule standard for all Western European monasteries. Benedictine monasticism remained the dominant Western monastic form for over 1,000 years, from approximately 820 to the French Revolution. The scriptoria flourished in this reformed monastic context. Monasteries became centers of manuscript production, preserving classical texts alongside biblical and patristic writings. The monks saw their work as a sacred duty. Copying manuscripts was a form of prayer, a way to serve God by preserving knowledge. This religious motivation produced extraordinary dedication. Monks spent countless hours in cold scriptoria, carefully copying letter by letter, word by word, preserving the literary heritage of Rome. This church-state fusion created mutual dependency. The church gained secular protection, financial support, and enforcement power for its decrees. Charles gained divine legitimation for his conquests, an educated administrative class drawn from the clergy, and ideological unity for his diverse empire. But this fusion also created tensions that would plague medieval Europe for centuries. Who held ultimate authority, emperor or pope? Could the pope depose an emperor, or could an emperor control the church? These questions would explode into open conflict in the investiture controversy of the 11th and 12th centuries. But for now, during Charles's lifetime, the partnership worked because both sides needed each other. The immediate catalyst for clarifying this relationship came in April 799, when Pope Leo III was viciously attacked in Rome. The conspirators attempted to blind him and cut out his tongue. Leo escaped and fled to Charles at Paderborn seeking protection. Charles restored Leo to Rome in November 799. The Pope was deeply in his debt. That debt would be repaid on Christmas Day 800. 2 days before Christmas, Pope Leo stood before a synodal assembly in Rome with Charles presiding as judge. Leo placed his hand on the Gospels and solemnly swore his innocence. The symbolism was clear. Charles, not Leo, held ultimate power. But 2 days later, that power relationship would be dramatically inverted. As we have seen, Charles knelt in prayer at St. Peter's Basilica. Leo crowned him Emperor of the Romans. The crowd acclaimed him 3 times. Then Leo prostrated himself before the new emperor. Einhard claims Charles was surprised and displeased. Most modern historians are skeptical that the rapid minting of coins after the coronation suggests advanced planning. Why would Einhard record Charles's supposed displeasure? Likely for diplomatic reasons. By claiming surprise, Charles avoided appearing dependent on papal authority for his imperial title. The coronation created the problem of 2 emperors. In Constantinople, the Byzantine Empress Irene claimed to be the sole legitimate Roman emperor. Charles's coronation challenged this monopoly. Charles even proposed marriage to Irene in 802, hoping to unite East and West. Byzantine courtiers prevented acceptance, fearing Western domination. Years of diplomatic negotiation followed. Only in 812 did Michael I grudgingly recognize Charles as emperor, but notably not as emperor of the Romans. This compromise acknowledged Charles's imperial status while preserving Byzantine claims. The ambiguity established a precedent that would haunt medieval Europe, the principle that the Pope could confer imperial authority. Charles himself resisted this interpretation. In 813, just months before his death, he crowned his son Louis as co-emperor in Aachen, not in Rome. He excluded the Pope from the ceremony, establishing an alternative source of imperial legitimacy. Regardless of the tensions, the Christmas 800 coronation was a world historical event. The fusion of Germanic, Roman, and Christian identities was complete. The Carolingian Synthesis had achieved its ultimate symbolic expression. With the imperial title secured, Charles turned to the practical challenge of governing his vast empire. He had conquered territories stretching from the Atlantic to the Danube, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. How could one man govern such diversity? His answer was the Missi Dominici system envoys of the Lord. These were paired inspectors, one ecclesiastical and one lay, who traveled throughout the empire on Charles's behalf. They conducted 4 annual inspections per district, hearing legal appeals, investigating complaints against local officials, ensuring that royal capitularies were being enforced, and reporting back to the emperor. In 802, Charles reformed the system, replacing poor vassals with high officials to reduce corruption. The system was imperfect, but it represented an ambitious attempt to extend royal authority across vast distances in an era before modern communications. The empire was divided into counties. Estimates range from 110 to 600 counties, depending on how scholars count them. Each county was governed by a count who exercised royal authority in the emperor's name. The count administered justice, collected taxes, raised military levies, and maintained order. Around 780, Charles created the Scabini, 7 professional legal experts attached to each count's court. These specialists provided expertise in Frankish law and ensured more consistent judgments. Charles governed through capitularies, royal legislation distributed empire-wide. The Capitularia Project has identified 282 surviving manuscripts containing Frankish capitularies, demonstrating the scale of dissemination across the realm. These manuscripts were copied in monasteries and episcopal scriptoria, then distributed to counts, bishops, and abbots throughout the empire. The administrative sophistication rivaled that of the late Roman Empire. Charles's government maintained written records, enforced standardized laws, conducted regular inspections, and employed specialized legal experts. This was not the primitive tribal governance of earlier Germanic kingdoms, but a complex bureaucratic system. However, the system's effectiveness depended critically on Charles's personal authority. The Missi Dominici acted in the emperor's name. The counts governed because Charles had appointed them. The capitularies were obeyed because Charles commanded it. When Charles's personal charisma and military reputation no longer backed the system, would it continue to function? That question would be answered in the decades following his death. Charles understood that political unity required economic integration. In 793 or 794, he implemented a major monetary reform, establishing a standardized currency system based on the silver denarius. 240 denarii equaled 1 pound of pure silver. The system used a 1:20 to 240 ratio, libra to solidus to denarius. This ratio became the foundation for European currency systems for over a millennium. The Carolingian pound-shilling-penny system survived in England until decimalization in 1971. When the British finally abandoned pound shillings and pence in the 20th century, they were ending a monetary tradition Charles had established. Approximately 60 mints produced denarii across the empire, distributed from Nantes to Venice, from Dorestad to Barcelona. Major mint locations included Cologne, Metz, Trier, Strasbourg, Pavia, Milan, and Barcelona. The denarius coins displayed the king's name on one side and the mint location on the reverse, facilitating trade by making coin origin and authority immediately recognizable. The monetary reform drove a sudden surge in silver production from Mel in France, which became the primary silver source for Carolingian denarii production. Charles took increasing control over how and where coins were made, centralizing monetary authority. The monetary reform served symbolic and religious functions as much as pragmatic ones, but the economic impact was real. A standardized currency reduced transaction costs, facilitated long-distance trade, and enabled more complex economic activity. The parallels to modern European monetary union are striking. In 2012, Christine Lagarde, then head of the International Monetary Fund, gave a speech drawing explicit comparisons between the Carolingian livre and the modern euro. Both represented attempts to create monetary standardization to facilitate economic integration across linguistically and culturally diverse territories. Charles's public achievements are well documented, but who was he as a person? Einhard provides intimate details. Charles's gait was firm, his carriage manly, and his voice clear. He was temperate in eating and drinking, abominating drunkenness. He enjoyed swimming so much that he built his palace at Aachen specifically for its warm springs. Charles's family life was complex. He had at least 5 wives over his lifetime. His third wife, Hildegard, bore 9 children in 11 years before dying at approximately age 26 in 783. His fourth wife, Fastrada, ruled alongside him from 783 to 794. His fifth wife, Luitgard, served as queen from 794 to 800. After 800, Charles took concubines, but never remarried. In total, Charles had 18 or more children. Yet despite his obvious affection for family, Einhard notes that he traveled with them constantly. Charles never allowed any of his daughters to marry. He kept them unmarried until his death. Historians speculate this was to prevent the creation of rival power centers or competing claims to inheritance, but the decision reflects the patriarchal control typical of medieval royalty. The court at Aachen was more than a political center. It was an intellectual community. Alcuin of York, Theodulf of Orleans, Engelbert Einhard, and other scholars formed a circle of learned men who engaged in theological debates, composed poetry, copied manuscripts, and advised the emperor. The palace complex included a library scriptorium, a mint, and even a menagerie. In a famous gesture of international diplomacy, the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid sent Charles an elephant as a gift. The elephant, named Abul Abbas, lived at Aachen for several years, a living symbol of Charles's connections to the wider world beyond Christian Europe. The court culture Charles created functioned as an extended royal household. Governance was personal and direct. Charles knew his major officials individually. He rewarded loyalty with land and titles. He punished disloyalty with exile or execution. This personal style was effective while Charles lived. His physical presence, military reputation, and intellectual curiosity commanded respect and inspired fear. But charisma cannot be inherited. Personal qualities cannot be institutionalized. In 806, Charles issued the Divisio Regnorum at Thionville, a comprehensive succession plan that divided the empire among his 3 sons. Charles the Younger would receive Austrasia, Neustria, and Saxonia, the Frankish heartland. Pepin of Italy would continue to rule Italy, Bavaria, and the eastern territories. Louis of Aquitaine would govern Aquitaine, Burgundy, Provence, and the Spanish March. The 3 brothers were expected to cooperate in defending the empire's borders and maintaining Christian unity. The document was rooted in Frankish tradition of partible inheritance. Notably, it was silent on whether the imperial title would continue. Was the emperorship personal to Charles, or would one of his sons inherit it? The division of realms represented the triumph of rational planning. Charles had learned from his father's division of the kingdom between himself and Charlemagne. He sought to prevent the fraternal warfare that had nearly destroyed the realm. Each son would receive a substantial kingdom. Hopefully, they would cooperate rather than fight. It was a beautiful plan. It was also doomed to failure because it depended on circumstances Charles could not control. The survival of all 3 sons. Within 5 years, 2 of them would be dead. In 810, Pepin of Italy died at approximately age 33. The Italian heir was lost. Charles's carefully balanced division was suddenly unbalanced. Then in 811, Charles the Younger died at approximately age 39. 2 of 3 heirs were now dead. The entire succession plan was nullified. Only Louis of Aquitaine remained. Charles himself was aging. He suffered from frequent fevers and developed a limp in one foot, likely from arthritis, as confirmed by skeletal analysis in 2010. Einhard notes that Charles detested physicians' advice, preferring his own remedies to professional medical care. In his testament of 811, Charles divided his treasure empire wide, with 21 archbishoprics receiving equal shares. The will demonstrates his piety and his concern for the church's welfare after his death. In September 813, just 4 months before his death, Charles crowned Louis as co-emperor. Crucially, he performed the coronation himself in Aachen, not in Rome. He excluded the Pope and had the Frankish nobility provide the acclamation. This was Charles's final statement on imperial authority. The emperorship derived from dynastic succession and Frankish acclamation, not from papal conferral. For 4 months, father and son ruled as dual emperors. It was a transition period, a passing of the torch. But Charles must have known that Louis lacked his martial reputation and commanding presence. Louis had governed Aquitaine competently for 33 years, but he was a regional ruler, not an empire builder. Could he hold together the vast realm Charles had conquered? The demographic fragility of dynastic succession was laid bare. 2 sons dying in consecutive years revealed that even the best planning could not account for disease, accident, or simple bad luck. Personal charisma and military genius could not be bequeathed in a will or transmitted through a coronation ceremony. In January 814, Charles developed a high fever, followed by pleurisy. He prescribed for himself his usual treatment: fasting. Einhard notes that Charles continued to starve his fever, refusing to eat. The self-imposed treatment only exacerbated his condition. On January 28, 814, at 9 o'clock in the morning, Charles died. He was approximately 72 years old, according to Einhard's calculation, or about 71 years old according to the Royal Frankish Annals. He had reigned for 47 years, nearly half a century. He was buried the same day in the Palatine Chapel at Aachen that he had built. His body was placed in an ancient Roman Proserpina sarcophagus, a pagan artifact repurposed for Christian burial, symbolizing the synthesis of classical and Christian cultures that defined his reign. A gilded arch bore the inscription, Charles the Great and Orthodox Emperor. Einhard's moving account as an eyewitness conveys the sense of loss felt by those who knew Charles personally. Contemporary sources describe widespread grief across Europe, whether through genuine affection or recognition of his achievements or simple fear of what would come next. Charles's death was mourned as the end of an era. In 2010, skeletal analysis confirmed many of Einhard's physical descriptions. The remains showed a man approximately 6 feet tall with arthritis in his leg that would have caused the limp Einhard mentioned. Science validated biography 1,200 years after the emperor's death. Charles's death marked the end of personal rule by the man who had reshaped Western Europe. The question now was whether the institutions he had created could survive without his personal authority to enforce them. Louis inherited the entire Carolingian Empire and all its possessions. The transition was smooth, no succession crisis initially. Louis had been formally crowned co-emperor 4 months earlier, providing clear legitimacy. But Louis was not Charles. Where Charles had been a warrior king who spent decades campaigning across Europe, Louis had governed Aquitaine as a regional sub-king for 33 years. Where Charles had possessed commanding physical presence and personal charisma, Louis was pious and scholarly but lacked his father's martial reputation. 3 contemporary biographies of Louis survive the very existence of multiple conflicting accounts suggests that Louis's reign was controversial and contested in ways Charles's had not been. The imperial institutions continued functioning, capitularies were still issued, the Missi Dominici still traveled, the Scriptoria still produced manuscripts, Caroline minuscule still spread across Europe. The cultural programs Charles had initiated persisted and even flourished. Louis brought Benedict of Aniene to Aachen as his chief monastic advisor. The Aachen councils of 816 and 817 standardized Benedictine monasticism across the empire, putting official stamp on reforms that had been underway for decades. This was a major cultural achievement, one that would shape Western monasticism for 1,000 years. But political unity proved more fragile. Magnates began to resist imperial authority. Borders came under threat from Viking raids in the north, Muslim incursions in the south, and Slavic pressure in the east. Without Charles's personal dominance, the centrifugal forces within the empire began to overwhelm the centripetal institutions. The lesson was becoming clear. Institutional continuity was possible, but political unity required more than institutions. It required personal authority that could command obedience from powerful nobles. Louis, for all his piety and administrative competence, could not inspire the same fear and respect his father had. In 817, Louis issued the Ordinatio Imperii, dividing the empire among his 3 sons. Lothair pensuncri Wakpapib. Ban and Waxis and that's Einar. Leictunen Louis the German. Lothair was designated senior co-emperor, creating unequal inheritances that bred resentment. The consequences were disastrous. In 833, Louis's own sons rebelled against him at the Field of Lies, where his supporters deserted him. He was forced to undergo public penance at Soissons, confessing crimes and submitting to humiliation. Historians call this a key moment in Carolingian decline. The sacred authority of the emperor was degraded, showing that imperial dignity could be overthrown by rebellious sons. Louis was restored to power in 834, but the damage was done. The empire was revealed as unstable, dependent on personal relationships among family members rather than institutional authority. In 840, Louis died after a tumultuous 26-year reign. His death triggered civil war among his sons. In 841, at the Battle of Fontenoy, brothers' armies slaughtered each other in one of the bloodiest battles of the 9th century. Contemporary sources describe the horror of internecine bloodshed. Frankish killed Frankish Christian, killed Christian. Finally, in 843, the 3 brothers met at Verden and agreed to partition the empire. East Francia went to Louis the German. This territory would eventually become Germany. West Francia went to Charles the Bald. This territory would eventually become France. Middle Francia went to Lothair, who retained the imperial title but ruled a strip of territory from the North Sea to Italy. This Middle Kingdom would fragment into Italy, Burgundy-Lorraine, and the Low Countries. 29 years after Charles's death, the unified Carolingian Empire ceased to exist. The political unity he had forged through conquest had shattered. 3 separate kingdoms now occupied the territory he had ruled as one. The thesis is proven. Personal charisma could not be institutionalized. The empire depended too much on Charles's unique combination of military prowess, political skill, physical presence, and personal authority. Without him, the centrifugal forces of regional identity, linguistic difference, and noble ambition pulled the empire apart. 3 brothers standing at Verdun in 843, dividing their grandfather's empire. The sword that forged unity now split inheritance. The political experiment ended. The imperial dream died. But the cultural revolution continued. The Treaty of Verdun represented political failure. Charles would have been devastated to see his unified empire divided among squabbling grandsons. All of that political unity collapsed within a generation. Yet this is not a story of failure, it is a story of paradox. Political fragmentation coexisted with cultural endurance. While the empire fragmented, Charles's cultural and institutional innovations survived and thrived. 90% of surviving classical Latin texts exist today because Carolingian scribes copied them. Virtually every classical Latin text that survived to the Carolingian period still exists today. Those that did not reach Carolingian scriptoria are permanently lost. The Caroline minuscule script became the foundation for modern lowercase letters. When Renaissance humanists discovered Carolingian manuscripts, they mistook the script for authentic ancient Roman writing. They modeled their printing types on it. Thus, every book, every screen, every lowercase letter in the Western alphabet descends from the script Charles's scholars created. The 7 liberal arts curriculum Alcuin brought to Aachen structured European education for 1,000 years. The cathedral and monastic schools mandated by Charles evolved into medieval universities. The educational system Charles created shaped intellectual life throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. The Benedictine reforms outlasted the empire by a millennium. Benedictine monasticism remained the dominant Western monastic form from approximately 820 to the French Revolution, more than 950 years. Few institutions created in the 9th century survived into the 18th and 19th centuries, but Benedictine monasticism did. The Carolingian pound, shilling, penny monetary system survived in England for 1,200 years until 1971. When the British finally decimalized their currency in the 20th century, they were ending a monetary tradition Charles had established in the 8th century. Charles received the title Pater Europae, Father of Europe, in 799 in his own lifetime. The designation was not mere flattery. He had created a new cultural synthesis that defined European civilization, a fusion of Roman administrative genius, Christian religious authority, and Germanic warrior culture. The Holy Roman Empire continued nominal existence until 1806, 1006 years after Charles's coronation. Throughout that millennium, European rulers claimed to be Charles's successors, inheriting his imperial legacy. From the 16th to 20th centuries, Franco-German debates raged over Charles's nationality. Was he French or German? The question was anachronistic. National identities as we understand them did not exist in Charles's era. But the debate revealed his enduring symbolic importance. Both France and Germany claimed him as their founder. After World War II, European leaders deliberately denationalized Charles, making him a pan-European symbol of unity, transcending national boundaries. In 1950, just 5 years after the war's end, the Charlemagne Prize was established in Aachen to honor individuals who contributed to European unity. Recipients include Konrad Adenauer, Bill Clinton, Pope Francis, and Volodymyr Zelensky. In 2012, Christine Lagarde, then head of the International Monetary Fund, drew explicit parallels between the Carolingian monetary system and the modern Euro-European monetary union. In this interpretation, represents the fulfillment of Charles's vision of economic integration. Modern European Union rhetoric selectively appropriates Charles's legacy. It emphasizes unity culture, educational achievement, and economic integration. It downplays or ignores the conquest, forced conversions, massacres, and brutal subjugation through which Charles created his empire. This selective memory is understandable, but ahistorical. Charles's achievements and his atrocities cannot be separated. They are two sides of the same coin. Let us return finally to Christmas Day. 800, Charles kneels at St. Peter's Basilica. Pope Leo places the crown on his head. The crowd acclaims him Emperor of the Romans. It is the symbolic culmination of Charles's life work. Charles could not have known that his political empire would fragment within 30 years of his death. He could not have foreseen the Treaty of Verden, the division into France and Germany, the 1,000-year rivalry between those nations. Had he known, he would have considered his life a failure. But Charles also could not have known that his cultural synthesis would endure for over a millennium. He could not have foreseen that the scriptoria he established would preserve 90% of classical Latin literature. He could not have imagined that the script his scholars developed would become the foundation for modern typography. He could not have predicted that his educational reforms would shape European learning for 1,000 years. The paradox is complete. Personal charisma proved fragile, but ideas and institutions transmitted across generations. The sword that built the empire rusted away, but the pen that preserved classical wisdom still writes. Charles's true monument is not Aachen Cathedral, magnificent as it is. His true monument is not the Holy Roman Empire, which claimed his legacy for 1,000 years. His true monument is the letters we read, the books on our shelves, the universities where scholars study the very idea of a unified European civilization. Every classical text, every university, every notion of Europe bears his fingerprints. He is Pater Europae, father of Europe, not because of his empire's size, but because of his civilization's shape. Territorial conquests fade, political empires fragment, but cultural legacies, education literature, institutional innovations endure across centuries. This is the lesson of Charles, King of the Franks, Emperor of the Romans, father of Europe. This is the paradox that defines his legacy. The sword that forged the empire has long since turned to rust, but the pen that preserved classical wisdom, that pen still writes 13 centuries later in the script Charles's scholars created, preserving the text, Charles's monks copied, transmitting the ideas, Charles's educational reforms spread. That is the true legacy of Charlemagne.